Jungkook was a man who had everything: power, wealth, and an empire he had built from the ground up. But he also had a heart as cold as the winter's wind. To him, relationships were a distraction, something that could only complicate his perfectly structured life. His marriage to YN was no exception. It was a strategic move, a merger arranged by their families to solidify their businesses. YN had accepted her role as his wife and his secretary, knowing that love was not part of the deal. She had agreed to the marriage because of her family's wishes, hoping that over time she might melt the ice around his heart. But years had passed and Jungkook remained distant, treating her like an employee both at work and home. One rainy night, as YN sat alone in their penthouse, she watched the clock. Jungkook was working late again. She had prepared dinner, a simple meal she knew he liked, but she doubted he'd show up in time to eat it. This had become their routine, her waiting, him not showing up. When he finally came home, the food was cold and the clock had long passed midnight. Jungkook didn't even acknowledge her as he walked past, his suit drenched from the rain. YN's heart sank, but she tried to hide her disappointment. "Jungkook, you should eat something. You've been working all day," she said softly. "I'm not hungry," he replied, his tone as indifferent as ever. She looked down, her hands tightening into fists. "You always say that." He sighed, loosening his tie. "I don't have time for this, YN. I have a meeting tomorrow morning. I need to prepare." "Is that all you ever think about?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Work, meetings, schedules. Do I even exist to you outside of the office?" He paused, his expression unreadable. "You knew what this was when we got married. It was a business arrangement. Nothing more." His words felt like a knife to her heart, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I know, but I thought maybe, after all this time, you'd at least try to make this work." Jungkook's eyes darkened. "Don't expect things that were never promised, YN. I never wanted this marriage." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "Fine," she whispered, turning away before he could see the hurt on her face. "I won't bother you again." She walked to her room, closing the door behind her. She knew she should have let go of her hopes long ago, but the small moments when he showed any warmth, any hint of care, always pulled her back. She clung to those fleeting seconds, even if they left her feeling emptier than before. The next morning, YN arrived at the office as usual, professional and composed. She handed him his coffee, greeted him with a polite smile, and went about her tasks efficiently. No one in the office would have guessed the pain she carried inside. She kept everything hidden behind her polite demeanor. Jungkook, as always, remained distant. He avoided eye contact and barely spoke to her unless it was about work. YN felt like a ghost, someone who existed only to fill the roles of his secretary and wife, but never anything more. Months went by, and YN continued to pour her heart into her work, hoping that if she showed him her dedication and care, he might see her differently. But nothing changed. Jungkook was as cold and detached as ever. One night, after another long day, she decided to confront him. "Jungkook, do you ever think about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression blank. "There is no us, YN. You are my secretary and my wife by name, that's all." Her heart shattered, but she forced herself to smile, even as tears threatened to fall. "I see," she said, her voice trembling. "I understand." She turned to leave, but before she could, he spoke again, his voice softer. "YN, I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't give you what you want." She stopped, her back to him. "It's not about what I want, Jungkook. It's about what we could have been." With that, she walked away, knowing deep down that nothing she said would change the emptiness between them. One fateful day, YN received a call from her family. Her father had fallen ill, and she needed to return home for a while. She informed Jungkook of her departure, but his response was as indifferent as always. "Do what you need to," he said without looking up from his computer. "I'll manage." Those words stung more than she expected. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I'll be back when he's better." He only gave a brief nod, and she left the office, feeling as if she were walking out of his life entirely. She had always hoped for some sign that he cared, but he gave her none. Days turned into weeks, and YN's father's condition worsened. She spent her days at the hospital, caring for him, while her nights were filled with thoughts of the life she had left behind. She missed Jungkook, despite everything, but she knew she couldn't keep waiting for someone who might never change. One night, as she sat by her father's bedside, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Jungkook. How is he? It was the first time he had reached out to her personally. She felt a glimmer of hope, but it quickly faded when she realized that it was probably just out of formality. She typed a quick response. "He's not doing well, but I'll manage." There was no reply. Back in Seoul, Jungkook stared at his phone, the unread message lighting up his screen. He felt a heaviness in his chest he couldn't ignore. He had always thought that keeping his distance was the best way to protect himself, but now, with YN gone, he realized how empty his life felt. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating, and he found himself reaching for his phone every night, hoping she would call. But she didn't, and he knew he had no right to ask her to. A month later, YN's father passed away. She stayed with her family to help with the arrangements and provide support, but inside she felt broken. When she finally returned to Seoul, she found the penthouse exactly as she had left it, cold and empty. Jungkook was at the office when she arrived, so she went to her room to rest. That evening, when he returned, he found her sitting by the window, looking out at the city lights. "YN," he started, his voice hesitant. She didn't turn to face him. "I lost him, Jungkook. My father is gone." He stood there, feeling an unfamiliar ache in his chest. "I'm sorry." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I needed you, but you weren't there." His hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't know how to be there for you. She finally turned, her eyes filled with pain. "And that's the problem, isn't it? You never tried. You always kept me at arm's length, and now I'm too tired to keep hoping you'll change." He felt his heart sink. "YN, don't," she said, her voice breaking. "It's too late." Jungkook watched as she walked away, and for the first time, he felt truly alone. He had pushed away the only person who had ever cared for him, and now he was left with nothing but regrets. In the weeks that followed, YN filed for divorce. She handed him the papers in silence, and he signed them, his face blank, but his heart shattering inside. She left the penthouse, leaving behind the life she had tried so hard to build with him. As he sat alone in the darkened room, Jungkook realized that he had lost the one person who had ever tried to love him. And for the first time in his life, he wished he could go back and change everything. But he knew he had only himself to blame.